everyone, and welcome to today's webinar in the CERTUP and ESTCP webinar series. My name is Rula Deeb. I'm a Senior Principal at Geosyntac Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of CERTUP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's call. The webinar will consist of a brief overview of CERTUP and ESTCP by Dr. Herb Nelson, followed by a list of upcoming webinars in the series. After Herb's opening remarks, we will transition to the technical portion of the webinar. Today's event features the second of two training sessions that will walk participants through the process of preparing a quality assurance project plan for the use of advanced geophysical classification in munition response investigations. The training will be delivered by two presenters, Dr. Jordan Adelson and Dr. Ed Corll, both from the Navy Laboratory Quality and Accreditation Office. Again, this is a two-part training exercise. Part one was delivered on May, and the slides for that webinar can be downloaded from the CERTUP and ESTCP website. On today's event, Dr. Corll will start with a discussion of the data review process when preparing a QAPP. We will pause to answer some questions, and then we will transition to Dr. Jordan, who will then present the portion of the training on data management and assessments before offering some concluding remarks on the use of QAPPs for advanced geophysical classification investigations. Finally, we will provide an overview of project organization and personnel and wrap up the webinar with a final Q&A session involving both our speakers. Just a reminder, today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of the screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we do encourage you to submit questions well in advance of the Q&A session. On this slide, we have provided a few suggestions in the event that you experience difficulties with the broadcast audio. Typically, any delay will be fixed if you refresh your screen or call into the conference line. However, if you continue to have problems, please submit a comment using the chat box and we will be happy to assist you. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Herb Nelson, who has been serving as the CERTUP and ESTCP Program Manager for Munitions Response since 2007. In addition, Herb is currently serving as the Acting Director of CERTUP and ESTCP. Prior to joining the programs, Herb was a research chemist at the Naval Research Lab in Washington, where his work focused on the detection and classification of buried UXO. Herb, on to you, please.
Thank you, Rula, and I'd like to add to Rula and welcome you all to the webinar today. Morning for some, just after lunch for me. So just as Rula said, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the two programs. As you can see in the logo on the top of the slides, most of you will know this, of course, but there may be a few newcomers who know that we are two programs. CERTUP, which is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. It is a little older program. It was established by Congress in 1991, and is a partnership between DOD, DOE, and the EPA. So CERTUP is the R&D program, where, as you can see in the two sub-bullets below, we address advanced technology developments and fundamental research aimed toward solving DOD environmental issues. The companion program is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, and this is a demonstration validation program in DOD words, where we look to capitalize on the investments from the research program and demonstrate these technologies in both environmental and energy technologies at DOD sites. So in this thing we focus on transitioning technology out of the laboratory, facilitating regulatory acceptance, all toward promoting implementation. And of course the webinar that you're about to hear today falls into this latter category. This is really moving technology out of the lab into the useful production workforce. So we are divided into 5 program areas, 4 in CERTUP, 1 in ESTCP. They are energy and water, which is ESTCP only, and then both programs have a program area in environmental restoration. munitions response, which is the subject of this webinar, resource conservation and climate change, and then weapon systems and platforms. The last of those mostly focuses on surface coatings, production practices in our DoD rework facilities and maintenance lines that have environmental consequences. Munitions response, as I said, is the purpose of this. We've, for many years, focused on munitions on land, and in fact, the last 6 or 7 years of that was almost exclusively on advanced geophysical classification, which is the function of this webinar. That effort is really coming to a close, and now the focus of both programs is on munitions in the underwater environment. And we're many years behind underwater as we were on land, so those of you who have been aware of this program for a while will know how the development will go. But we're focusing now on both detection surveys in wide area or footprint reduction, recovery and disposal underwater, which is much more challenging than it is on land, and then lots of characteristics of the underwater environment as it pertains to munitions, such as mobility of munitions in energetic environment, storms, and the like, and what the clutter background looks like to support that first bullet, the detailed survey bullet. So you are listening now to the webinar on the munitions QAPP, the Advanced Geophysical Classification QAPP. Here is a listing of the next 4 webinars. Obviously, some of these will be interesting to some of you, not all, but some will. So if you are interested, please hit our link on our webpage and register. And with that, there's the link that one can go to do the registration. And with that, I'll hand it back to Rula to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Herb. It is now my pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers. Dr. Jordan Adelson currently serves as the Director of the Navy's Laboratory Quality and Accreditation Office, and also as the Chair of the Department of Defense Environmental Data Quality Work Group. As Director of the Laboratory Quality and Accreditation Office, Dr. Adelson manages the accreditation programs for the Naval Shipyard Material Testing Laboratories and implements quality system requirements on all Naval Sea Systems Command testing laboratories. As the Chair of the Environmental Data Quality Work Group, he works with representatives from all branches of DoD, oversees the DoD Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, and develops and recommends DoD policy with respect to environmental sampling and testing operations. Dr. Adelson has a PhD in environmental analytical chemistry from the University of Maryland. Our second speaker is Dr. Ed Carl, who is the Deputy Director of the Naval Sea Systems Command Laboratory Quality and Accreditation Office. He has worked for this office since 2009. He oversees the Naval Shipyard Materials and Engineering Laboratory Accreditation Program and also coordinates work on various areas of environmental data planning, sampling, and analysis. Ed previously worked for 12 years performing environmental analyses for the Naval Public Works Laboratory at the Norfolk Naval Base, and then for 6 years in the Technical Support Division for NAVFAC Atlantic, where he served as an in-house expert on emerging contaminants, analytical chemistry and analysis, and risk assessment. Dr. Corral earned his PhD in environmental engineering in 2015 from Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. And with that, I'm going to turn it off to Ed, who's going to kick off the technical portion of this webinar.
All right. Thank you, Rula. I appreciate that intro, and welcome back. All good morning, good evening, wherever you may sit. I thought that before I get into these slides, I would do just a very brief recap. And by the way, just a reminder to all of you, the first part of this session that was presented in May is actually available. The presentation is available for downloading on the website, and also that session was recorded as well. So you can, if you did miss that first part, you can go back and you can listen to that recording. So as Rula said, this is actually the second part of this particular training session. And in the first part, Jordan and I spent some time doing an introduction to the USP QAPP, which is actually originated from EQTF, and some of the history and the genesis of the application of the advanced geophysical classification into the QAPP format. And during that, we also spent some time discussing some of the critical worksheets that's part of documenting the systematic planning approach for planning a geophysical classification project, and how important things like the conceptual site model and our data quality objectives are in building our investigation, so that ultimately we can receive, we can get data of known quality for its intended purposes. And what I hope to show you in this next section, which is really about data review, if you think about the QAPP, or one of the beautiful things about the QAPP, is it's actually sort of a circular process. And whereas we talked about systematic planning before, you're going to find that what the QAPP and these worksheets that we're going to be discussing today kind of comes full circle. It's sort of a retrospective review at looking at the data and the quality, the QA and QC that we have, and relating that back and looking back at our data quality objectives and looking back at our conceptual site model to make sure that we do, in fact, have the data that we set out for. So, in this presentation, in this section, I'm going to be going over basically 4 worksheets. And what you're seeing here, the verification, the validation, and also the process validation that we have specifically for advanced geophysical classification. And then the ever important, the last worksheet in our data review section is worksheet 37, where we're going to look at what we call a data usability assessment. So just real quickly, these are worksheets 34 through 37 that you will find in the QAPP. Verification is basically a completeness check, and I'll go into some more detail. I'll show you a screenshot of that in just a second and go into some more detail on that. Data validation, which is where we look at compliance to specific criteria or requirements. And then the data usability assessment, where we basically take all of the QA and all of the QC, and we plug that back in and look at our data quality objectives, look at our measurement performance criteria in worksheet 12, and we relate that back to whether we can say that we have data that is fit really for its intended purposes. So worksheet 34, again, is a data verification. It's really basically a completeness check that all the specified activities have been completed and documented. So focus on worksheet 34. The key word here is on input. So simply said, do we have all the inputs, and these are the documents and records that we need to in order to proceed to validation. And again, that validation we're using to evaluate whether we have conformed to specific stated requirements that we have all planned and put together as part of our requirements for this project. And that would be things like, have we met our accuracy and have we met our precision and those type of things. And worksheet 34 simply lists the inputs to the data verification, the validation, and also to the usability. So it's going to be the required documents and records. It's going to include field records, and it's going to include both interim and final reports as well. So this is a screenshot of worksheet 34. And again, you'll see that these are simple. It's a simple checklist, really, of the input to the records and the documents that are used during verification, validation, and usability. The table identifies the description of each item, and basically it verifies that they're present and that the necessary records, what we call objective evidence, are available in order to proceed to validation. And where you're going to see where this box is checked, it basically indicates that the data required for either verification, for validation, and the data usability assessment are present and available as described for each and every one. So moving on to worksheet 35, so the key word here actually is procedures. So worksheet 35 simply documents the procedures that we use to verify and to validate. So whereas the verification in the previous worksheet in 34, we were basically a checklist at looking at the inputs, identifying what are the key records and documents that we're going to be using. The validation evaluates whether the specific criteria have been met here and the procedures that we use to do that. So it documents when and how and who is responsible for doing each and every one of these steps. I do want to remind you that the blue text that you're seeing in these tables, and actually any of the worksheets, the blue text are simply examples. They're not meant to be comprehensive lists, and they may not fit for every single scenario. So these are provided simply as examples and a starting point, really, for project teams when they're doing project planning. So again, this is a screenshot from Worksheet 35, the data verification and validation procedures. It simply shows what validation and verification procedures are used, where the criteria can be found, who's responsible for it, for each one, and a description of the procedure and how it's documented. And most of these, for most QAPPs, these are going to be documented in the SOPs. Note that there's going to be daily and weekly QC reports, and then of course there's going to be final summary records reports as well after each phase. So these are also referenced. If you go back and look at worksheet number 17, these are referenced in specific definable features of work, or DFWs, that are identified in worksheet 17. So it's all very nice how the QAPP kind of cross-references these requirements into specific worksheets so you understand when and where and how and who they're done in each and every step of the process. So worksheet 36, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on worksheet 36, which for all intents and purposes really captures the verification and validation plan. So worksheet 36 documents the procedures implemented at the site specifically to validate the anomaly detection and classification approach. So we have added confidence in our sample design abilities to select the anomalies in our ranked anomaly list, and to make sure that we meet project-specific detection thresholds for further investigation, and also that we correctly classify the anomalies to distinguish between our targets of interest and the non-targets of interest. So we basically do this in three ways. The first one that we do is based upon the seeds that we use. These seeds are blind, both validation and quality control seeds that are in place at the site. Now, just to refresh your memory from part one, the QC seeds are actually in place by the contractor. That's the folks who are actually doing the geophysical classification process for us. So their quality person is in placing these seeds. Now, the folks who are actually running the instrumentation, they don't know where those seeds are, what type they are, or at what depth, but their quality person does know. The quality assurance or validation seeds are actually in place by the government or by a government's representative. So these sort of represent a double-blind type of seeds, and they would also be very analogous to performance testing or proficiency test samples that our chemical laboratories use. So these are double-blind to the contractors that are doing the advanced geophysical classification for us. So the second way that we do this as part of process validation is that we have threshold verification digs in order to make sure that we verify the selection of the appropriate threshold. So as our contractor has completed the classification and they develop their ranked anomaly list, they will develop a threshold, basically what we term as a stop dig threshold. And what we have done to increase our confidence and prevent false negatives in this process is we are going to perform 200 additional what we call threshold verification digs. So these are additional digs that are actually intrusively investigated beyond the last target of interest, right? So this is to ensure that we have, in fact, validated and properly selected that stop dig threshold. So that's step two. And then the third way that we do this process validation is we evaluate something called our validation digs, which actually is a validation of the entire process. And these validation digs, what we do is we randomly select 200 non-TOIs. Now, these are the items that we have classified as actually being non-TOIs. So we are going to randomly select 200 of those, and we're going to intrusively investigate them and, in fact, confirm that the reason that we call them, those intrinsic properties, the reason that we call them non-TOI are, in fact, true. So this is basically an overall basis of what's going to be captured in the verification and validation plan, and is all part of the process validation that is captured in Worksheet 36. Now moving on to Worksheet 37, also the data usability assessment. You know, as I said before, the QAPP really is sort of a circular process, really, from the planning, the execution, the management, the review, the decision documentation. The data usability assessment really is the last step that really closes this loop of our retrospective review of the key aspects of systematic planning. So it includes both qualitative and quantitative evaluation of the environmental data against the DQOs that we specified in Worksheet 11 and the measurement performance criteria that we specified in Worksheet 12 to make sure that the data are the right type, they're the right quality, and they're the right quantity that we scoped, and that supports our decisions relative to the conceptual site model and the underlying assumptions that we had going into building of the systematic planning process. So the data usability assessment evaluates whether the sources of uncertainty have been managed, the data are representative, the conceptual site model has been unchanged, and again, those underlying assumptions are supported, and whether the results can be used as intended with an acceptable level of confidence as we have previously set them up during systematic planning. A little bit more detail about the data usability assessment is we are going to identify in this worksheet the responsible personnel for performing the DUA. So this can be, as you can see here, it can be the RPM, the manager, the quality assurance manager, the geophysicist, the field geophysicist, and even the stakeholders. All these folks have an integral part in the data usability assessment that's captured in Worksheet 37. It also captures the DUA inputs, and again, these are just examples. And I'll actually refer you back to 34. If you remember, Worksheet 34 lists the inputs that are used. And in the far column on Worksheet 34, it showed the inputs that are used, those little check boxes for the data usability assessment. And they are basically repeated here. So it's a little bit redundant, but there should be some consistency there. But these are recorded in Worksheet number 37. So now the actual data usability assessment process that we have configured is basically in 4 general steps. And in the first step, which is the review of the project objectives and the sampling design, we're going to ask specific questions such as are the DQOs, which is in Worksheet 11, and the measurement performance criteria, Worksheet 12, are they still applicable? Are the underlying assumptions that we had in the data quality objectives and the MPCs, are they still valid? If the DQOs and the MPCs have been changed, have the changes been documented? And should we or did we change any specific data quality objectives relative to those changes? So is the sampling design consistent with the project objectives? All that's captured in step 1. In step 2, where we have the review of the data verification and the outputs of validation, and we also evaluate conformance specific to the measurement performance criteria that we documented in 12. So we may ask questions like, have the data been verified and validated as described on the earlier worksheets, Worksheets 35 and 36, and evaluate very specific conformance to the criteria and the specifications that we documented earlier in Worksheet 12. Are there impacts from nonconformance on our overall data usability? The third step of the DUA process, where we document data usability and we update the conceptual site model and we draw a final conclusion. So we may ask simple questions like, have the DQOs been achieved? And can the data be used for their intended purposes? So again, it's sort of a retrospective evaluation, and we'll come back full circle to our data quality objective process. Are there any limitations on the data use? Is there any new information that we found during the process of the investigation where we need to add or update the conceptual site model? Update the conceptual site model and document the usability conclusions in the data usability summary report that's part of the final DUA process. And finally, step 4, we have as document lessons learned and making recommendations. And this is basically where we ask questions like, could the DQOs, could the MPCs or the sampling design be improved for similar future studies, and summarize our general lessons learned and make recommendations for general changes if we're going to do some further investigations. So as a summary, I've sort of quickly stepped you through 4 primary worksheets. Again, data verification, especially the worksheet 34, really looks at our inputs, and we check to make sure that all specified activities have completed. In other words, this is a completeness check. Did we do all the things that we were supposed to do, and do we have all the things that we're supposed to have? Data validation, especially worksheet 35, where we document the procedures of verification, validation, and data usability. And again, this is specifically evaluating conformance to stated requirements that we've identified in the QAPP and in our SOP. So these would be things like criterion specification relative to precision requirements and accuracy requirements and the like. And finally, I just walked you through the data usability assessment, which is worksheet 37, where we have both qualitative and quantitative evaluation of the data against the original DQOs and the original measurement performance criteria of worksheet number 12. And ultimately, what we're trying to do here in the final report is collectively work as a team, and this includes our regulatory entities, in the end, to make sure that we have collected data that are the right type, the quantity, and the quality that we need to make the right decision that was specified originally during project planning. Finally, I want to remind all of you that remember that the project team really agreed to these goals, and the project team actually is helping in sort of closing this final evaluation and closing the loop on our visit to the DQO. So if nothing really has changed dramatically, if we've collected all the right QA/QC and we've done our verification and validation properly, then really it makes the review of the final report and the acceptance of the final report and the decision making should be very, very expeditious and very easy for the project team. And that's the reason the QAPP is structured in the way that it is. So with that, that's it. I guess we're gonna have a short Q&A session. I'm prepared to take some questions if anybody has any.
Excellent. We have received a number of questions. Here's the first one. Shouldn't the description of inputs on worksheet number 34 directly correlate to the list of activities and records reviewed on worksheet number 35? For example, instrument assembly is listed on worksheet number 35, but it is not called out specifically on worksheet number 34.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that what we have in the tables in this template, they're just examples. And yes, the answer to your question is they absolutely should be listed properly, and they should be correct relative to your specific project. But the entries that are in the template, these are only examples, so they're not meant to be absolutely specific. So just kind of keep that in mind, that when you're populating these for your specific project, that those should be consistent and they should be spelled out very directly in terms of what the exact inputs, what those records, and what those documents are going to be.
Thank you, Ed. Here's a question from the U.S. DoD Explosive Safety Board. Are the 200 validation digs and the 200 threshold digs the standard numbers for non-TOI digs for every project, or do these numbers vary from one project to another?
Okay, so yeah, this is a very good question. And I'll start off this answer with basically the genesis of where the 200 number came from. You know, when the subgroup that developed this template for advanced geophysical classification, which again is from the IDQTF, the Intergovernmental Data Quality Task Force, and it includes members of, we had members of the regulatory community, both the state, and of course it's chaired by the EPA. And then we had folks from sort of an ESTCP and the DoD's Environmental Data Quality Work Group as well. So the 200 number was basically just a consensus number that we all came up with and we all agreed to. So this is the recommended number that we do recommend for most projects. We have found, based on previous investigations and previous data, that the 200 number, both for the threshold verification and the process validation, work very, very well. And it has been shown that really that there are not too many, and there's never a case where there's not enough either. So we've always been able to verify that threshold, and we've always been able to positively use the data to confirm those intrinsic properties of the non-TOI. So I think the direct answer to the question is yes, our recommendation is that that 200 number should work for all of your projects. Certainly projects are flexible, and the project teams can use a graded approach. If the project team decides they want to use a little bit more or a little bit less, that's a project decision. But we do recommend the 200, and they should work for just about all the cases.
Thank you, Ed. If during the data usability assessment we determined that we have not met a performance criteria in Worksheet 12 and potentially did not meet a subsequent data quality objective, what then?
Yeah, wow. So that's an extremely good question. And first of all, bear in mind that the QA and QC processes that we have built in to the advanced geophysical classification process means that there's going to be QA and QC that's done on a daily and on a weekly basis. As I had expressed during session 1, Worksheet 12 are critical because they represent our measurement performance criteria. And if we miss a measurement performance criteria, it can have dramatic effects on our ability to say that we've met our data quality objective. So the direct answer to this question is this could be a very bad thing. It could mean we're in a situation with this major issue where we have a failure where there might be rework. In fact, there usually is going to be rework. The important thing to remember is that when these cases happen, communication is important. And if there's an MPC failure, it needs to be handled right away, number one, and it has to be a project decision. So it's going to require the original project team to reconvene to determine what the true effects that this has had on our ability to use the data, and it could mean rework for some of this. So yes, it's a very critical. If there's a non-conformance to a measurement performance criteria in Worksheet 12, it's a very, very critical finding.
Thank you so much. Few more questions. Are the same type of seed items and depths used for the QC and validation seeds? Okay, yeah. So a great question. As I had referred to before, so the QC seeds are those seeds that are in place by the quality person that works for our contractor. So although they are unknown to the crew that's actually using the instrumentation, they are known to the contractor's quality officer. Now, our suggestion and the way that this should be planned into the QAPP is that those QC seed items should actually be placed really at the limits of the detection threshold in terms of depth. They usually are the same items between the validation seeds and the QC seeds, by the way, to answer that part of the question. But the reason that we suggest the QC seeds be placed at or maybe even below the detection threshold is because we want to make sure that if we can meet those QC seeds, then we certainly should not have a problem at all when we get to the QA seeds. Now, again, the QA seeds or the validation seeds, these are the seed items that are placed by the government. So they're double blind to our contractors. And it's a major problem. It's a major nonconformance if we miss one of these validation seeds. And those validation seeds are not placed as deep as the QC seeds. So I hope you can understand where I'm going. The QC seeds, because we can recover, right, we can do corrective actions for a failure of a QC seed, there's nothing wrong with basically pushing our ability at that specific threshold, that specific depth that we have documented for seeing each and every item at our particular site, that the QC seed should be placed. Some of them should be placed either at or even below that threshold, but the validation seeds are placed usually just above that threshold. So a little bit different in terms of depth, but they typically are the same type of seed items between the QA and the validation seeds. Thank you, Ed. Maybe one last question before we transition to Jordan. Are the verification and validation steps happening at the end of each phase day grid and prior to moving to the next, or is everything done at the end of the project?
Yeah, so as I had referred to earlier, the answer to that is both. Again, there are specific QA and QC processes that are performed on a daily basis. I mean, the IBS strips and the function test. So we have daily tests. We have weekly QC reports that are done and assessments that Jordan's going to get to in just a moment. And also we have the final reports. We have data usability reports at the end of the detection phase and also at the end of the classification phase. And I also want to remind the audience that, as I said earlier in this presentation, we have inputs listed on worksheet 34. These are the documents and records. We have procedures and the frequency of those procedures of validation on 35. But we also have, during each of the definable features of work that we have on worksheet 17, there are specific items that are listed in worksheet 17 as well that are performed as outputs that are performed at the end of each DFW. And also on worksheet 22, we have our measurement quality objectives. There are specific MQOs and specific criteria and the frequency and who's documenting. So there are multiple QA and QC steps that are done throughout the project. At the beginning, they're done daily, they're done weekly, and of course they're done in the end. And then of course the final report is the culmination in that data usability assessment on worksheet 37 as well. So the answer is it's all the above. I mean, QA QC is really done throughout the life cycle of the entire project.
Thank you so much, Ed. Please, for our audience, keep the questions coming. You can submit them by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of the screen. And we will have another opportunity towards the end of the webinar to ask Ed some additional questions. But now we're going to turn it over to Jordan, who's going to discuss the second to last part of this presentation. Please proceed, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Rula. And actually, before I sort of dive into my section where I'll be talking about data management and assessment, one of the things I wanted to sort of touch on was in that last question that Ed answered kind of really set me up well for this. Typically when we would give training or go through how to prepare a QAPP, the last thing we would discuss was that section that Ed just talked about. The last thing that you typically do is you go through verification, validation, and then a usability assessment to really make sure that the project and the data you've collected could help you actually answer the questions that you established in your data quality objectives. But we intentionally, when we set up this training, actually did not make that the last step in the process of presenting this to you. And that has to do with the fact that when we do classification projects, data is coming in all the time. And actually, throughout the entire project, we're doing actually a large portion of the verification and part of the validation the entire time. And so it's an ongoing process. We don't wait till the very end of the project to get there. And so our training sort of follows through with that kind of a concept, because what you'll see is when we talk about reports and data flowing back and forth, there'll be constant checks that go on and go forward. So your verification and part of your validation is actually occurring throughout the whole process of the project. And so it's kind of important to note this is not necessarily standard for a lot of the other investigations that we do, but it's definitely ties into how this technology is set up and how we intend to use it going forward. So the section I'm going to talk through now is data management and assessment. And the relevant worksheets that I'm going to be going through are worksheet 13, which really focuses on secondary data uses and limitations. There's a lot of, there has been in the past, some confusion about what we mean by secondary data. And so I'll go through that and tell you a little bit about what that means and then how to sort of evaluate secondary data and then how that's documented in the worksheet. As well as worksheet 29, talk about project documents and records. This is obviously a key part of the process. As I just mentioned, there's a lot of information that flows back and forth, and so you have to really be sure how you're going to, you want to really document, and in the QAPP itself, what documents you're going to pass forward, what records you're going to keep, And so that's kind of critical, obviously, to ensuring that the project is going to be historical reproducible. You'll have the necessary information, and during the process of the project itself, the deliverables that you expect will be coming through. And then finally, worksheet 31, 32, 33, which talks about the schedule for assessments, and then obviously what those assessments are, and then who's responsible for corrective actions in the process going forward. And so as I mentioned, the objectives I'm going to be going through here is, other pertinent data, which is that secondary data aspect of it, identifying the primary resources, primary records and documentation, identifying assessments and corrective actions. And so if you look at that puzzle piece that both Ed and I have talked to from the very beginning, that sort of lays out the process of the QAPP, and what kind of builds into it. In the previous sections, we really kind of focused on one sort of puzzle piece. But if you look at the worksheets that I'm covering, I'm actually covering 3 of these puzzle pieces kind of across the board. And it's just sort of how it breaks out. And it's kind of how our mindset had to change a little bit when we adjusted these worksheets for use with advanced classification. But still, it all falls under this concept of either assessment, and here in project management objectives, and then measurement and data acquisition. And so, but this puzzle piece really does a great job of sort of describing the overall QAPP process. So secondary data, worksheet 13 really focuses on secondary data. And what is secondary data? Well, it just simply stated it's data that was generated for another purpose other than this specific project. So if data was collected leading up to this project for this specific site, if data was collected, other outside data that you'd want to use. And the question then becomes, if data exists, how do I know if I can utilize this data, or how do I know how I can use this data? So I might be able to use it, but not completely with the way it was intended. And really it just comes right back to your data quality objectives. So you develop your data quality objectives. In that, you've established your measurement performance criteria out of that, and you use those criteria to evaluate the data, to consider if it's usable for the project that you have at hand. So examples of secondary data would be data generated from previous investigations. If you remember, this is really the way this QAPP is set up. It's focused on the RA phase of investigation. So you might have other previous investigations at this site. So any of that other data generated would be a good example. Related published literature, meteorological data that exists, interviews or photographs, historical data. And this can be either internal or external, or qualitative or quantitative data. But when you look at this list of examples of secondary data, what really should be coming out to you is these are the things that sort of make up your conceptual site model, right? So using this information really is going to feed into that initial conceptual site model that you developed to really push forward what your investigation is going to be looking for and the gaps that you need to fill with this investigation. And so that's really the focus of how worksheet 13 is really set up. It's set up to pull that information together. So you'd be getting information, for example, of the type of munition used at that facility. That would be secondary data because you'd have that information from some historical information or from data generated from previous investigations. So this is what the worksheet looks like. The data type would be listed like there. And then you go through the process of where the data came from, the data usage relative to current project, and then the factors affecting the data's reliability and limitations on the data use. So things you'd want to consider about that. And so to discuss that a little bit further, what are the limitations of the secondary data, right? And how do we assess them, right? So the first thing you obviously want to consider is the credibility of the source. So where did the data come from? Is it an area in which I can trust that data going forward? When it was collected and by whom? Who collected the data and when it was collected? There is typically, not always, but typically a pretty good relationship between how long ago the data was collected and whether or not you can use it. What you end up finding is the longer it's been since the data has been collected, the less information that exists that support that information. And so you have to that weighs against its use, or at least it increases the limitations for how you can use that data. And obviously the best case scenario is that if there were previously developed data quality objectives and you had access to that and what those data quality objectives were and how they match with what your current project needs are. I have to say that in many cases, previously collected data, if they have DQOs, they might not have always been thought out properly, or they don't always match up really well, they're not documented well. And so that's always the best case scenario, but that's not always available. And then we check to see if the data itself is consistent with your current conceptual site model. So if there's new data that's presented, it runs completely counter to what you've already collected in your conceptual site model, that would actually have you question its credibility because it stands out as an outlier to potential data that already exists. And this is something that obviously you'd want it to be discussed and agreed upon during the planning meeting. Obviously, this would be documented on Worksheet 9 during that phase of development to ensure that the whole project team kind of obviously agrees with the process going forward. So the next worksheet I'm going to talk through is Worksheet 29, which really focuses on data management and project documents and records. And so, this is obviously key for us because, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of information that goes back and forth. And so how those documents are controlled, how those documents, what those documents look like, that really is the focus of Worksheet 29, and sort of who gets those documents is obviously also of interest and concern going forward. And so as we're in the process of developing the QAPP, there still is software development ongoing. And one of the things that we're trying to get ourselves around is unionizing around consistent documentation and records and how that communication will be formatted going forward. And so we're working with the software folks to get this in a standardized format. I've mentioned this in the first session when we were going through the QAPP, is that, our plan here is that, once we've got a year or so of development under our belt and implementation of the advanced geophysical classification utilizing this QAPP tool, we plan on actually updating the document based on lessons learned. And by that point, obviously, we hope that the document management and record situation will be unionized around the outputs of the software, so there will be a lot of consistency associated with this. And so this is sort of what the worksheet looks like, obviously. It kind of details, this is a few examples of some of the documents that you'd sort of want to see going forward. You want to define how files are transferred back and forth, that type of situation. And actually right now, the folks at the Corps and the Navy are actually working on exactly what information they're going to want to get from the final project for retention and storage. And so that kind of information obviously will be detailed in the sheet as well, and that will help them in archiving information and getting things sort of settled. And so the final worksheet that I'll be talking to really focuses on assessments and corrective actions. And so, the obvious benefit of having a quality assurance project plan is you've clearly defined what your quality steps are, what your requirements are going forward. All of the things that you want to do should be documented and laid out. But what this worksheet really goes through is, how do I ensure that stuff's been done? So how do I know along the way in the process that that's been done? And the way that we do that is through assessments. And so these assessments can be multi-flavored. They could be internal assessments performed by the contractor themselves. They could be external assessments performed by the DoD, or during the planning phase, the regulatory agency can request and have assessments that they're going to want to be participating in and leading, actually as part of this process as well. And so these worksheets actually go through the process of documenting the schedule of these assessments, right, as well as what the assessments cover. And so if you look at the worksheets, so right here is sort of the upfront material for the worksheet. The way that we laid it out in the template was, and remember this is blue text, and Ed sort of talked about this a little bit, and I'll use this opportunity to kind of refresh your memory. So in we use different color text in the template. The green text is guidance on how to complete the worksheet. The blue text is examples, and the black text is recommended minimum requirements. And you'll see here in the blue text, what we did for the template was we actually laid out the assessment activities based on the different related activities of the project. So you'll see that we, site preparation, detection survey, cube survey, and intrusive investigation. And then you have a schedule for assessments and the like associated that come out of that. And so the next worksheet obviously details the assessment type, the responsible party, and then the schedule and frequency of the assessment. So some of these might be ongoing. You might do it once a day or twice a day. The assessment deliverable, what's going to come out of that assessment, right? Because if you don't document the fact that you did the assessment, what's the point of actually conducting it, and then when the deliverable is due from that assessment. And that the deliverable due date doesn't necessarily have to be a specific day. It could be related to a certain period of time after the assessment was done, and that can be specified in this table as well going forward. And then that's table 31-1. Table 31-2 really goes through the assessment response and corrective action. And so this is really where it documents who's responsible for the assessment findings, right? The assessment response documentation, what you expect back after the assessment, and what time frame should it take for that response to come back, and the responsibility for implementing the corrective action, who that person is, and then who then monitors the implementation of it. And so you'd want to lay those things out. And this obviously becomes critical in a situation. The time frames become very important when you're talking about advanced geophysical classification. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that with this technology, as I said up front in this presentation, is that that we're constantly getting data in, and things are being collected, and we're reviewing that data in a real-time basis. And so we want to ensure that if there is a problem, we catch it early on in the process, and we can make adjustments and not get ourselves in a situation where we have to recollect a significant amount of data. Okay, and so this really helps to put us on the right track to ensure that doesn't happen. And it's very, very key to name the responsible parties for ensuring that the situation doesn't continue, and that we actually do get remedies to the corrective action issues. So, in summary, a well-developed and integrated procedures for data management and assessment ensure that the data is complete, ensures the integrity of the data, the traceability of its measurement, and the ease of its retrieval. And so, those worksheets, all together really sort of put you on the right path to meet that goal and put it forward. And so, I know that when you look at some of these worksheets and you see the level of detail that we're asking, it seems on some level maybe a little bit burdensome. But the truth of the matter is that as you pull this information together and as you document it up front, while it is a lot of work up front, what you end up finding is on the back end, it makes your life a whole lot easier. And it helps really provide that confidence for the implementation of this technology and for the fact that it's going to be done correctly going forward. And so with that, it leads me into the general conclusions for this entire presentation. So the conclusions that I'm going to talk through now go through everything we've sort of discussed from the beginning at the first presentation back in May, and sort of wrap everything back together going forward. As I go through these conclusions, this is that same puzzle piece that I mentioned. You've got to remember and put yourself hopefully in your mind in the right context for the fact that when we started down this pathway, the real goal here is for us to develop a process in which this technology can be implemented. So obviously a major concern for us is regulatory buy-in to a technology in which a larger concentration of metal will be left on the site. And so the quality control and quality assurance criteria that we built into this, the level of documentation that we built into this, is really towards that end, is to take all the great work that the folks at SERP and ESTCP have done in developing this technology and really carry it forward so that we can ensure a consistent and proper implementation. Because we really want to make sure that we continue to have regulatory support, which we do at this point, for the use of this technology, and this QAPP is really designed really to assist with that and to hopefully keep us going along in the right direction. So, these are some of the features of the QAPP template. I actually touched on some of these just a moment ago, but one of the major things we include is a crosswalk table identifying where required quality system elements are addressed. When we talked about the QAPP in general up front, back in the first session, one of the things that we clearly identified and went through was that we did not use all the worksheets. The UFP QAPP was originally developed for really chemical investigations, and so not all the worksheets are relevant for advanced classification. And so a lot of the effort that went into putting it together was to really identify which worksheets we're going to be using and then modify them as necessary for the use with this. I also touched on this concept of the green text, blue text, and black text, which is throughout the document, where the green text provides instructions and guidance for completing each worksheet. The blue text provides examples for what we envision in the worksheets, and Ed mentioned this as well. and the black text obviously identifies minimum recommended requirements where applicable. And so one of the things that I should mention is that in the planning phases, when you show up at your scoping sessions and you're going through the planning meetings for this, is that you really should strive to have already identified the areas in which you're going to be varying from the black text. This way, it could really lead to discussions in the scoping sessions and really focus things on not what the standard practices you're going to go for more, but really what you're trying to do that's different from those standard practices. And the other point that leads me to is that, and we've actually had questions like this in the past, and that is when you're at a scoping session, when you show up at the scoping session, you shouldn't show up with a complete blank worksheet, right? You already have information that built you up to having some form of a conceptual site model that should lead you into the initial discussion. And so you should complete as much of the worksheet as you possibly can prior to the scoping session and really focus your discussions on things like those variations from the black text and ensuring that you do have buy-in in the conceptual site model. And that sort of leads me to the next sort of bullet, which is that the template is based on the RA phase of investigation. So by that point, should be a wealth of information for the site that should help you be able to document what you need to go forward. And once again, fill out some of those worksheets prior to the initial scoping sessions. And the project teams should modify as needed for other phases. So if they want to use advanced classification, the worksheets themselves can be modified. And actually, there's nothing in the worksheets that can't be modified. Like I said, it's the black text that really, for us, is where we want there to be some justification and identification for what you're changing. Because that really, if you look at the template itself, the black text really focuses on the MPCs and the MQOs. So your measurement performance criteria and your measurement quality objectives. And when you vary from those, we want there to be an explanation for why you're not meeting that quality criteria. So the QAPP template features the concept of problem formulation documentation, key personnel roles and communication pathways. It identifies what data are needed and quality limitations, procedures for work and review, reports and deliverables, assessments and corrective actions, verification and validation, and then ultimately the data usability. And this really lays out the entire sort of concept for the Uniform Federal Policy for Quality Service Project Plans. And going right from this, we're going to get consensus on a problem statement, the fact that we've collected data that's been reviewed, that's been agreed upon, and we've demonstrated that it meets our data quality objectives, and we can now go forward and make an ultimate decision based on what the project was trying to accomplish. So in further summary, the template is a planning and documentation tool, and that's actually a really good point that I think I've hit on, but I want to make sure that I touch on as strongly as possible, is that it's a tool really not only just for the planning, but also as the place for you to document this information so that you can have the information in a consolidated place, in a standardized format to make the review process and the ability to do historical reconstruction and defensibility of the data fairly consistent and easy to do. Upfront project planning is critical. Obviously documenting the conceptual site model, and these are things, like I mentioned, that you can bring with you, obviously, fully formed or mostly fully formed to project planning meetings. Data quality objectives, obviously scoping sessions are critical to the process. It's important to note that worksheet completion is an iterative process, right? You go through the process of completing them, and you might actually identify further down the pathway a change that needs to be made, and that's actually going to affect other worksheets, and you're going to go around until you get things sort of right. And that's a standard practice in completing the QAPP, and it's part of that heavy lifting in the upfront part of planning in this fashion, and then having to go back and sort of make sure things are right, so that in the end, life becomes a lot easier, and you're really setting yourself up for success. And so, this concept of including regulatory partners is critical to us. To us, this is really, really foundational to acceptance, right? Is having regulatory partners involved in the planning phases and engaged and knowledgeable about what's going on, so that you address their concerns up front, and it facilitates, the regulatory review process, so that things go smoothly because they were involved in the planning phase, and also it minimizes rework. And that's part of this whole process of ensuring the quality of the data when it's collected, this ongoing verification and validation that occurs with this, as well as the assessments that we've sort of outlined. Because it really is designed to help you catch mistakes, in as live a fashion as possible, and then make adjustments and go forward. systematic planning and decision making, if you can't agree on the problem and objectives, then reaching agreement on a solution is not likely. And so, I've told the story before. I know I told it on the first offering, and it's a story I'm fond of, so unfortunately for you guys, I'm going to tell it again. But, when the QAPP was first being developed, the first test run was done. A guy by the name of Mike Carter, who was at that point Deputy Director of EPA's Federal Facilities Restoration and Reuse Office, was really spearheading the implementation of the QAPP. And so the first place they went to demonstrate it, they had it was like a 2 or 3 day planning session. They had a scoping meeting, and the whole project team was just sitting around the table. And after 2 days, they could not agree on a problem definition. They couldn't agree on a problem statement for what they were trying to solve in a site. And at the end of the meeting, the RPM came over to Mike and said, Mike, I think this whole thing you developed is a huge failure. I mean, here we wasted 2 or 3 days. And Mike turned around and said to him, I completely disagree. I think it was a huge success. Because here we sat around for 2 days and we didn't reach a consensus on the problem statement, but no one went in the field and took a sample. No samples were sent to a laboratory for analysis. We didn't expend any resources collecting data for a project where we have no idea what the goals are and objectives are. And so we have no hope of meeting them. And so to me, that example and that concept really hits home, right? If you cannot agree on the problem statement and get that problem statement right, everything that flows through from that will cause you problems throughout the project. And this goes through for the entire DQO process, which is why it's so critical that you set up your data quality objectives correctly. So in further conclusion, right, worksheets 12 and 22 really focus on parks. Ed talked about this in the first session. Really focus on precision, accuracy, representativeness, comparability, completeness, and sensitivity. The MQOs and NPCs really accomplish that and help you define what those needs are going forward. And QC and validation seeds really have a significant role in QA and QC for detection and classification. And, Ed hit on this, and it's important enough for me to reiterate this. The validation seeds, failure of those validation seeds have a significant impact on your ability to get the data to be used, to really have you continue doing work. The way the process is designed is the failure of validation seed causes a stoppage of work. And so that has a significant impact on the confidence that it's had about the organization's ability to successfully use this technology. And the concept of the validation seed is to meet that need. And so when we set out guidelines and guidance for implementing and replacing validation seeds, they are not put anywhere near the depths of detection or the thresholds for determination. They're put in the way so you should be able to detect them without any problem going forward. So that's why missing those has a significant impact, because what we're counting on is that you're going to find them. You should if you're running everything properly. Now your QC seeds should be put at more difficult depths. They should be put, maybe close to your detection threshold. They should be put across the range of places, but really they should be more challenging for you to come across than the validation seeds. Because if you're going to fail a seed, you should fail a QC seed before you fail a validation seed. And that's designed for you to be able to correct and identify problems that you have. And failure of the QC seed, if it's close to your detection threshold, can cause for us to maybe adjust what your detection threshold might be. And that becomes important, obviously, for the usability of the data. And so that's really where you want to put those QC seeds. I can't tell you enough how important that is, because the failure of validation seed, like I said, is going to be a difficult situation for everyone involved. And so those QC seeds should be in place at more difficult depths. And so, this slide really this graphic really is designed to sort of walk you through the entire process of the QAPP, right? So, you start with your conceptual site model, right, worksheet 10, where you put together all the information you have from historical investigations, secondary data you had. It really sets up your site. It really helps identify the information for the site that drives what your data quality objectives are, right? What do we need to achieve, okay? That goes into worksheet 11, right? That's your data quality objectives. And from that comes right out of your data quality objectives comes your measurement performance criteria in worksheet 12, right? And from there you go on, how do I execute the work? That's worksheet 17. Show the work was done correctly. That's worksheet 22, as well as outputs from the assessments, like I talked about in worksheet in worksheet 31, 32, 33. And then you evaluate, right, all activities and SOPs performed. Worksheet 17, all QC was documented. Worksheet 22, verification validations like Ed discussed earlier in 35 and 36, and then finally that data usability assessment, Worksheet 37. And in that process, right, what you're doing is you're taking the data and you're comparing what you've developed back to your DQOs, right? Have I met my requirements for my DQOs, and I can sort of finalize my conceptual site model. I always look at a QAPP process essentially as, I look at it in terms of the conceptual site model. When you start out the project, you have this model from the data that was available. You've identified what the problem is, and then throughout the project, you're getting your information to actually complete the conceptual site model, so it's no longer conceptual. So you've actually finalized that model along the way, and this sort of hopefully brings you to that same conclusion going forward. And so with that, I'm finished. Rule is going to open it up for questions shortly. But one thing I want to make sure that everyone is able to capture is that, Ed and my email address and our contact numbers are on the slide. And so as the process goes forward for implementing, the advanced classification, the advanced geophysical classification QAPP template, we encourage people when they have questions or they run into problems, please feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to sort of help you guys get this on the pathway. And we know that the use of QAPPs in this context going forward in this field is fairly new, and so we're happy to provide assistance to you guys to help you guys get this right and to implement this correctly. And so with that, Rule, I'll turn it over to you for facilitating the question.
Thank you. We did receive a number of questions, and in addition to downloading the slides, you can actually download the report. It's posted together with the slides on the CERTUP and ESCCP webpage. So starting with the questions for you, Jordan, can you please tell us if a project can use the EM61 data collected for a site during a previous investigation for the detection phase of a new investigation?
Right. So no, that's a good question. That really leads into the discussions that I had and talked about when I discussed Worksheet 13. Right. So that's secondary data, and it actually depends on how that data was collected, and it depends on the information you have relative to that. So the answer is it depends, obviously, but that type of evaluation, you really want to look at that data collected and compare it to the data quality objectives you have for this project. What kind of coverage did you get? What kind of information you have about the operation of the EM61 at the site? And so there's a chance that data can be utilized, as the detection phase going forward. If it was collected and meets your data quality objectives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Second question, please. If I have limited information about how the secondary data was collected, can I still use it for my project?
Yes, it can be used, but obviously it calls its credibility into question, right? So you have to weigh that data carefully. So if the secondary data that you have, if you don't have a lot of information like that EM61 data, that might be useful for you to get maybe some information back out, but obviously you cannot use it for definitive purposes if it's really, if you really don't have information to back it up. So that could cause data that you potentially could have used as quantitative information to use more as qualitative information. To give you more ideas about guidelines and information rather than making decisions based on that information.
Thank you, Jordan. There was some mention of the software producing standard documents and reports. Will this software be available for download by interested parties?
Right. So right now as many of you know, the technology, both the software and hardware, the commercial products for advanced classification are still going through levels of development. And so the software folks are working very well on getting some final versions of the software out, the updated versions of the software out. And so in consequent versions, in upcoming versions of software, there actually will be, I'm talking about the GeoSoft product, there will actually be standardized documents and records that are output from the software itself. And so those will come out with updates to the software.
Great, thank you. When performing assessments, the worksheet you showed has a column for the assessment deliverable. Does every assessment need a deliverable?
Yeah, and I sort of touched on this when I was going through the slide. Yes, every assessment does need a deliverable. We're big believers in the fact that if there's no documentation for something, then there's no way to prove that it happened, right? And so there needs to be a deliverable for every assessment that's gone forward, and obviously that'll continue and go with the records that are produced. And so you want to be able to maintain those records and control those records, and yes, you'll need a deliverable for every assessment that's performed.
Thank you so much. The QAPP template has a long list of assessment types in Worksheet 31-1 and 31-2. Do all projects have to conduct all of these assessments?
No. Ed sort of answered a question like this, earlier relative to Worksheet 34 and 35. All that's in blue text. Those are just examples for the type of assessments that you could put into place. Like I said, there are some, and I think you'll see this more or less as time goes by. I think initially some states will want to maybe play a larger role in doing their own sort of oversight and assessments associated with the technology. And as time goes by, you'll most likely see that less and less as more people gain confidence in the process and how things will work. But no, that list wasn't meant to be inclusive, and it wasn't meant to be something that everyone will need to do. It's just a list of examples of the types of assessments that we're anticipating people will want to perform.
Thank you so much. Can you please provide a more detailed explanation about the differences between MPCs, which is worksheet number 12, and MQOs on worksheet number 22?
Sure. And we actually get this question a fair amount. So worksheet 12, the measurement performance criteria, really are directly outputs of your data quality objectives. And so failing an MPC actually will have an effect on your ability to use the data. So by failing an MPC, you actually might have to change how data is utilized going forward. Worksheet 22, containing the measurement quality objectives, those are general QC checks. And failing those are recoverable. You can actually recover from failing those based on recollecting and going forward. And those typically by themselves do not have an impact on your data quality objectives. And typically what you'll see is your MPCs will, your MQOs will lead into your MPCs based on making up smaller pieces of the puzzle for your measurement performance criteria. And so, the way to really think of it is that at the end of the day, when you're doing a usability assessment, you're comparing the data, the output of those data to did you meet your MPCs. And so the MPCs are much larger based issues that really focus on your ability to use the data at the end of the day.
Excellent. 2 more questions and we'll be wrapping up. Do we need to develop separate DQOs for each definable feature of work?
No. That isn't something that we're gonna need to do. If you look through the example in the QAPP template itself, and we sort of went through this obviously in the first session, each definable feature of work is incorporated in the single DQO process. You really don't want to break the DQOs out any more than you have to. It leads to confusion. And as I just stated when I talked about MPCs, for each data quality objective or for each one of the breakouts of those data quality objectives within that process, you're going to have measurement performance criteria to ensure that you can meet those data quality objectives. And so by having multiple data quality objectives, you're really making the process very complicated. There are situations in which, and sites in which, you actually can have multiple data quality objectives, but for this type of investigation, I don't see it making much sense. I think rolling everything into the single data quality objective process makes a lot of sense using the example language that we provided in the QAPP template.
Wonderful. And last question, what happens if we need to make changes to a QAPP or SOP after a project has begun?
Yeah, and so that's a great question, and there's a number of the worksheets actually go through documents and document control and how that's handled. And the reason why we have all that communication pathway and all that information sort of up front in the QAPP itself is really so that it can support that, right? So that if there's a change to an SLP based on site condition, based on information that's been uncovered, that you can actually make those effective changes to the SLP, and then using your document control procedure and identification for who's received the documents, you can then redistribute that information to ensure that it's communicated well and that people are actually using that updated material. And it obviously would make sense at some point if your assessments would be occurring after that time frame to ensure that people are using the most recent version of the SLP and obviously or the change to the QAPP itself so the data is interpreted properly going forward. And so all that information obviously needs to be communicated, and it's important in every project for that information to be communicated going forward, but especially so with advanced classification because, as I've mentioned a number of times, the dynamic nature of the data collection, the fact that you're continually collecting data and then reporting it back out, if you've identified some issue that requires you to make a change, you want to ensure that that change carries through the entire process on an ongoing basis after you've made it, so that you don't revert back or you don't unintentionally utilize incorrect information to interpret the data and make a mistake. And so, the QAPP fully allows for that. There's documentation in there for how that's done, and then the document control process should control how that information is communicated back through the project team.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, and I'd also like to thank Ed. Our next webinar is on June 30th, and it will feature presentations on the use of geophysics for site characterization and remediation monitoring. We'll have two speakers, Dr. Lee Slater and Dr. Judy Robinson, both from Rutgers University. Registration is open for this webinar, so please visit the Startup and ESTCP webinar webpage to register for this and other future webinars. Before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would really appreciate it at this time if you can please take a moment of your busy day to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you for joining us.